So I mentioned these are Akan symbols um, from Ghana of the Ashanti people, and they mean go back and take, go back and learn. And what they're talking about going back to is going back to our history and learning from our history. And this Sankofa bird and this Sankofa heart represent going back and learning from history so that we can bring it forward with us into the future and we can learn from our past. And when I learned about this with the bird symbol, the feet are pointing forward on this bird, you can see, and the head is going back. The bird is still moving forward into the present, but it is reaching back and learning from the past to bring something forward. And I like to think about that spiral of going back and coming forward and going back and coming forward as that learning.
Our theme for this month is story. Today, Emma Rearick, Bob Coulter, and I will be sharing stories about our UU origins. Like many of you who have embraced Unitarian Universalism, I have sometimes struggled to come up with a succinct elevator speech to describe our faith and its rich history. Fortunately, I get more than 60 seconds today to begin to tell the story of who we are and where we came from. In the brief time I'm allotted, I will tell you how we came to be called Unitarians and just a bit about three famous Unitarian forebears. Our story actually begins with Jesus. Through the ages, people have pondered his life and his teachings. In the early centuries following his death, many people in the Christian church disagreed about who he really was. Was he the Son of God? Perhaps he was God. 325 years after Jesus' death, the Roman Emperor Constantine invited a group of Christian bishops to meet in the city of Nicaea, in what is now Turkey, to resolve once and for all who Jesus was. This council of bishops adopted what became known as the Nicene Creed, which affirmed the idea that God was three in one: Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. This is known as the Trinity, and Jesus, of course, was the Son in this trio. Not everyone agreed with this ruling. Not everyone believed in the Trinity. Many people believed that God was one, not three. These folks were known as Unitarians because they believed in the unity of God. The Council of Nicaea declared them to be heretics. According to the UUA's Faith Like a River curriculum, because Unitarianism and Universalism were outside the mainstream and were not organized, when we trace our history, we tend to include many who rebelled against the religious establishment as being our spiritual ancestors, even if they weren't specifically Unitarian or Universalists in their beliefs, but because they were people who chose to follow their consciences. Michael Cervedas was just such a person. He was born in Spain in 1511, 6 years after Martin Luther launched the Protestant Reformation. Servetus was a real Renaissance man, well versed in many sciences, including mathematics, astronomy and meteorology, geography, human anatomy, medicine, and pharmacology. He was also the author of many books. His first book, On the Errors About the Trinity, was published in 1531. It created such outrage among both Protestants and Catholics that he published a second book to clarify his position. This book, Dialogues on the Trinity, was even more unpopular than the first, requiring Servetus to flee for his own safety. He moved to France and assumed the name of Michael de Villanuev. This new Michael studied medicine in Paris and eventually became a physician in the city of Vienne. He is credited with discovering how the pulmonary circulation system in the body works. He, like many of our Unitarian ancestors, was a champion of science and reason. Sadly, Servetus was put to death in 1553 for the heretical beliefs he outlined in his first two books. He is considered to be one of the most celebrated martyrs of the 16th century. Unitarians often claim him as their own because his writings included the first systematic description of anti-Trinitarian thought. In the 1560s, shortly after Michael Cervedas' death, Unitarianism emerged in Poland and Transylvania. It was recognized as a religion in Transylvania by the 1570s and spread from there. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump ahead nearly 100 years to 1662. In that year, 2,000 clergy in England refused to accept Orthodox views, such as the belief in the Trinity, and they were ejected from their pulpits. Those dissenters became the spiritual forebearers of the Unitarians in England, who emerged as a movement another 100 years later. Among this group of dissenters was Joseph Priestley, an Enlightenment thinker who believed in the humanity of Jesus, the unity of God, and the scientific method. Like Cervedas, Priestley was a multi-talented individual. Considered the father of modern chemistry, he is credited with the discovery of oxygen and carbon monoxide. His chapel, home, and laboratory were looted and burned in 1791 by a mob opposed to his unorthodox theology. Priestley and his family escaped with their lives. 3 years later, in 1794, Priestley sailed for the United States, where he played a large role in the establishment of the first Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. Michael Cervedas and Joseph Priestley are just two of our notable Unitarian ancestors. Before I close, I would also like to make mention of William Ellery Channing, who has been called the single most important figure in the history of American Unitarianism. Channing rejected the notion of an angry, punishing God who was to be feared and encouraged his followers to develop a gentle, loving relationship with God. In 1819, he delivered a sermon titled Unitarian Christianity that became the key text for liberal religion in North America. Channing became the leading spokesperson for this new liberal religious movement, inspiring others with his writing and ministry at Federal Street Church in Boston. Among those who were influenced by him and his teachings were New England transcendentalists, including Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau.
As Pat reminded us, Unitarians believed in the unity of God. The stories she shared about Michael Cervedas, Joseph Priestley, and William Ellery Channing demonstrate how believing in God as one instead of three was considered heretical. God as one being instead of three sounds logical and not heretical to me, but as an atheist, I suppose I might be missing the point of the disagreement. Universalists, on the other hand, were heretical because they believed in the unity of people. As I understand it, they believed that instead of being judged by our earthly actions and sent to either heaven or hell, we will all end up in the same place. Why would a loving God create humans if they were destined for hell? Early Universalists wondered. If no one were destined for hell, they reasoned, then everyone must be destined for heaven. So universalism is a belief in universal salvation. We all will be saved. Just like unity of God doesn't sound too heretical, universal salvation might sound logical too. However, opponents worried that without the threat of hell, without punishment for wrongdoing, what would motivate humans to be good, to strive to do better, to not hurt thy neighbor? Chaos would reign, worried skeptics. So universal salvation was not acceptable if we wanted to maintain an orderly society. And perhaps the detractors were right, because once you believe in universal salvation, once you let go of that idea of punishment, what might you believe in next? My story today is about a Universalist, Olympia Brown. She was born in 1835 and raised in Michigan. Her parents were Universalists and taught her that God is a loving God, similar to Channing's loving God, and a God who loves everyone equally. Her parents valued education and allowed her to attend college at Mount Holyoke in Western Massachusetts. But there, Brown was exposed to mainline Christianity for the first time. The traditional God of the 1800s was one of fire and brimstone, fear and punishment. Reverend Erica P. Barron described Brown's revelation. She was horrified. Where was the loving God of her childhood in these prayer meetings? She was also confused. Which version of Christianity was correct? How would she find the truth? These questions weighed on her so much that she began a detailed study of the Bible in an attempt to solidify her own beliefs. As a result of her revelation, Brown ended up leaving Mount Holyoke and enrolling in Antioch College in Ohio. She also became driven to share the good word of a loving God to those who lived in fear of punishment in the afterlife. After graduating from Antioch, she applied to divinity schools. Women were not welcome at divinity schools in the mid-1800s, but after many rejections, Brown received a lukewarm maybe from the Universalist Divinity School at St. Lawrence University. She attended and graduated in 1863. On June 25th of that year, Brown was ordained by the Northern Universalist Association. She is often hailed as the first female minister whose ordination was recognized by a denomination. Brown's daughter noted many years later that the ministry was the first objective of her life, since in her youthful enthusiasm, she believed that freedom of religious thought and a liberal church would supply the groundwork for all other freedoms. A liberal church would supply the groundwork for all other freedoms. Brown firmly believed that if her loving God saw everyone as equal, she should work to make it so. For Brown, equality meant equality between the sexes. If a man could be a minister, a woman could be a minister. If a man could keep his name when he married, a woman could keep her name when she married. If a man could be married and maintain a career, a woman could be married and maintain a career. If a man could vote, a woman could vote. Brown married, kept her name, and worked as a parish minister, preaching in support of women's rights. Eventually, Brown devoted herself full-time to the women's suffrage movement, working to pass the 19th Amendment. At the age of 85, she was finally allowed to vote in her first presidential election. Brown believed in equality. She acted on this belief in her personal life, believing that she could do what a man could. She acted on this belief in her public life, advocating for women's right to vote. Universal salvation, universalism, taught Brown that people were equal. She took that belief and acted.
What is our creation story? All religions have a story or myth about how their faith started or how the earth was created. Since we UUs tend to be practical folks, we don't fret over the creation story of the earth, but we do recognize that there are many creation stories out there. But how about the origins of the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA? What do you know about the U's in UU? Emma and Pat introduced you to the two roots of our faith. Before the merger, they were known as the American Unitarian Association, the AUA, and the Universalist Church of America, the UCA. But how do we go from two independent faiths to being the Unitarian Universalist Association? To begin the research on this merger, I thought I'd go to the UUA bookstore and find a children's book on the merger. After all, when I was growing up as Catholic, there were so many children's books about Jesus and the church. And for a 5-minute talk, and I promise you 5 minutes, what better resource than a child's book? But no, in typical UU manner, there are lots of UU books on what our faith means in action. But how did we get here? You must dig into scholarly tomes. Fortunately for those who procrastinate, you can get books online and lots of information is out on the internet. And as an aside, the UUA does have an excellent website for this kind of research. This year, 2021, is the 60th anniversary of the official consolidation of the two faiths in 1961. This merger, like a marriage, you have two independent bodies with their own histories and biases. To help understand the differences and similarities between the two, I'd like to bring the devil into this conversation. Universalists' fundamental belief was a loving God, a God that loved her children as any parent does. And in the extreme of this belief, that even the devil could be redeemed and go to heaven. Unitarians started with the premise that there is only one God, and the traditional Christian view of the Trinity was a false view. Jesus was not the embodiment of God, but rather one of God's messengers. What type of messenger was debated, which became a distinguishing characteristic of Unitarians. They debated. And Unitarians, being Unitarians, have no unifying dogma and can't even agree if there is a devil. But merging the two, would be a devil of a process. What finally brought these two divergent views of theology together? The distant roots of both lie in Christianity, but over the course of time, they both converged on the concept of being a liberal church and championing social justice issues. Perhaps the critical driving force was the decline of universalism throughout the first half of the 20th century. By 1944, the declining fortunes of the Universal Church of America drove them to apply to the National Council of Churches, a partnership of over 38 Christian faith groups, as a step to merging with the Congregational Church. They were rejected as not being Christian, since they did not believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. It would be another 17 years before they would fully merge with the American Unitarian Association. In 1953, the Unitarians and the Universalists approved the merger of their youth groups into the Liberal Religious Youth Group. The first baby steps towards consolidation had been taken. Finally, in Syracuse, New York, in 1959, representatives of both faiths, approximately 1,000 of them, met to finalize the negotiations of a merger. As expected, there were many contentious issues that had to be settled, but none more so than the use of the words "thee" versus "our" in reference to the second principle of a free faith. Should it be the Judeo-Christian heritage or our Judeo-Christian heritage? Truly a devilish detail. The original proposal from the Universalists was to cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in their essence as love to God and love to man. Unitarians saw this as too close to a creed, and others wanted a clearer statement of their Judeo-Christian traditions. So another version was created. To cherish and spread the universal truths taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in our Judeo-Christian heritage is love to God and love to man. But should this be our or the Judeo-Christian heritage? There was passion on both sides. For the Universalists and Unitarians, this represented the chasm between them. The Universalists wanted their Christian roots to be explicitly acknowledged by calling it our Judeo-Christian heritage. The Unitarians had long ago separated from their distant Christian roots and could not accept a statement explicitly tying the new entity so closely to a specific religious tradition. In the end, the Universalists accepted the less explicit linkage, and the full and final phrase became, to cherish and spread the universal truth taught by the great prophets and teachers of humanity in every age and tradition, immemorially summarized in the Judeo-Christian heritage as love to God and love to man. And as you can see in the revised version of it in the 1985 modified Principles and Purposes, it is now Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves, which remains in the six sources of our faith. The merger was completed in 1961, creating one association with over 141,000 members and 895 congregations. In recognition of our roots, I'm no longer simply identifying myself as Unitarian. Instead, I will refer to myself as a Unitarian Universalist, or more simply, a UU.